Dia Guiv Galera Cordia August Foil wrote, welcome to be my guest with me, Mary Honan, on Lear Media TV, supporting the Samaritans, Limerick and Tipperary, Clare's Wish Foundation in Limerick, and Deal Animal Rescue in West Limerick. And my fabulous guest today has an extraordinary story of, well, a horrific story in many respects, but an extraordinary story of forgiveness, and that's Candice Mama. Have I pronounced your name correctly?
Oh, you did a brilliant job. Thank you, Mary.
Thanks very much. Candice, you found out, we'll start at the beginning. You were born in 1991.
Yes.
In South Africa.
That's correct, yes.
And at what age your father was killed when you were 9 months old? Yes, by de Kock, the Colonel de Kock. Now, how did you find out about it, and how did it impact you so much?
Yeah, first, thank you so much for having me, Mary. And I think for me, it was a very different kind of situation that I grew up in. And yes. So what happened was I first lived with my great-grandmother, and then I lived with my mother afterwards. And so already there was a bit of, I didn't have clarity as to what a traditional family was or what it looked like. But when I was around like the age of 8, I lived with my mom. And I remember she did tell me that, okay, your dad has passed away and he was killed by someone. And so I knew that. But then it was at the age of 9 that my mom bought a book. It was called Into the Heart of Darkness by Jacques Poe. And on the cover of this book, I remember my mom pointed at one of the men and she said, this is the man who killed your father.
And I remember 9 years of age.
Yes, at 9, yes.
And I believe she used to show this book. It had such a profound effect on her friends and anyone that came into the house.
Absolutely. So I knew there was a picture of my dad in this book, but I was never allowed to look inside it. And I only owned, I think, 4 pictures of my father at the time. And so I was very curious. I wanted to get another one, right? Just a kid's curiosity, I think. And I know my mom would like send me to go get this book anytime we'd have guests, especially initially when she bought the book. And every time, like I'd give her the book and she'd send me out. And every single time people would either cry or scream. And I started getting more and more curious. And so one day I eavesdropped outside the door and I heard the page number. So I scribbled it down and I was just so excited to get my moment, you know? And so that moment came and I remember my mom backed out of the driveway and I ran to the room, you know, I was so excited. I jumped on the chair, grabbed the book. I sat at the edge of the bed. And as I was paging through the book, I could tell that it wasn't going to, like, I just had a feeling because the pictures in the book are very graphic. And when I got to the page where my dad was, unfortunately, it was a picture of my dad's burnt body clutching a steering wheel and his eyes were protruding. And it was something like out of a CGI movie. And I remember just thinking, like I was just so shocked. And I remember tears welled up in my eyes. I shut the book. I threw it at the back of the cupboard and I went to my room and I started having palpitations. And I knew in that moment that I couldn't tell my mom what I'd done, but that picture was burnt into my memory for the rest of my life. Yeah.
And I was struck, I suppose, by reading about how at one stage, and I suffer with panic attacks, so I know exactly the impact of them and how bad they can be. But I was struck when I read about how you woke up one night very young and you thought you were getting a heart attack and it was so bad, and your mother rushed you to the hospital and you were put under anesthetic, but it wasn't a panic attack at all. It was ulcers, severe, the worst form of ulcers they had ever seen in the doctor had ever seen in anybody, and he had seen it in a young girl. You were only 15 at the time.
16, yes. Yeah. And so, yes, the story you referred to, I think, was in many ways the moment where my life changed, I'd say, because I was I was a depressed child, but I was also a very active child. So I was incredibly ambitious and driven. And I thought I was going to be an athlete. That's what I thought I'd do with my life. And so it didn't make sense to me having health issues, considering how I was eating and training. And so I was very healthy. And I remember when I was rushed to the hospital, I genuinely thought I'm having a heart attack, because it was the sharpest pain I'd ever felt in my chest. And when I went to the doctor, they did keep me under observation for that evening. And the morning after, I remember the doctor asked to see my mom and I. And he looked at me with just such concern and such almost sadness. Like there was a coldness, but there was also a sadness in his eyes. And I remember he said to me and my mom, and he said, in my over 20 years of experience, I've never seen stress symptoms so severe in someone your age. And he followed with the words, your body's killing you. And if you don't change what you're doing, I don't know how you're going to survive. And although I'd been suicidal, although I'd engaged with the idea of death a lot of times, it was the first time I really had to come to reckoning with that moment as to, am I going to choose to stay alive, or am I going to let this thing take me? Am I going to let the situation engulf me?
Isn't it fascinating how when you are faced with your own mortality, even at 16 years of age, somebody who is or has had these thoughts of suicidal thoughts, you go into fight or flight mode. You just you then want to live.
Absolutely.
It's
wonderful.
I was really fascinated by something you said about, when you're underwater, your body refuses to stop breathing. And no matter what, your body refuses voluntarily to stop breathing. That is so true.
Absolutely. And I think that's what I came to terms with, right? Like the human body, what we don't understand is we are living in one of the best designed systems in the world, right? Human intelligence surpasses anything we can create. And our bodies will not let us die. Like our bodies will never voluntarily, die. That's why when suicide attempts do happen, it is things that the body itself can't override. So you can't submerge yourself in water and drown yourself. You can't choke yourself to death. You can't do those things because the human psyche will always fight to survive. And I think there's beauty in that. There's beauty in the idea that we are designed to survive. We are designed to live. And I think what it does bring you to when you are faced with your mortality is you realize truly how the psychology impacts the physiology and vice versa, right? Like how what we think and what we perpetually put into our minds and systems and, ingrain into our psyche can actually have a physical impact on us. And I think for me, I realized that at a very early age, that my mind was actually killing my body.
Is that the reason really, they say that forgiveness is as much about healing yourself as forgiving the other person. Did you find that forgiving Colonel de Kock for your dad's death was as much about saying, look, this cycle of hatred has to stop? It's a very hard thing to do, and there are many people during the apartheid era and many people in all forms of genocide who find it very hard to forgive, and who could blame them? You had this strong capacity such that when de Kock was seeking release, you went on several occasions to support his release. That's astonishing.
Yeah.
A young girl, anyone would, knowing what he had done to their father, would, because there are some quotes that have come out of the Peace and Reconciliation, that you cannot forgive. The only people who can forgive are those that are dead and they're no longer living. How did you reconcile with what this man had done and be able to forgive him?
Yeah. So I didn't go to the trials or for his when he wanted to be released. That wasn't my way of advocating for him. What I did do is I ended up writing, because I ended up meeting him and then writing an open letter, which was published in one of our biggest newspapers. And 3 months later, his case was reviewed again and he was released. So that was my form of advocacy in his defense, I'd say.
And why
But
he should be released, Candice?
excuse me, Mary, I didn't hear you.
Why did you feel he should be released?
Yeah. So there were a number of things that had transpired up to that moment, right? Firstly, I want to address, just backtracking a little bit, to the forgiveness element. I think for me, what I realized was there's two factors to forgiveness. Forgiving is first and foremost about you. I think I grew up in a society and in a system where it's like, I think all of us globally have grown up with the idea that forgiveness is for the other person, right? You're doing it for them. It's a gift you're giving them. But the truth is, without forgiveness, you can't release yourself. You are constantly a prisoner to someone else's war, right? And so what I liken it to is, when you're living with resentment and pain because of a trauma, the first point of trauma is the first impact, right? That's the first time it happens to you. That's the first moment. But when you relive it and you're living in that resentment, pain, and it's coloring how you a partner to your spouse, or how you parent your kids, or how you move through life, that becomes a repeat trauma. You live that trauma again and again and again. And the only time you can break that is through releasing. You have to forgive so that you can be better and you can live a better life. And then for me, the second part of forgiveness becomes the reconciliation aspect of it. So that is when you go to the person who's hurt you and you choose to extend that branch of forgiveness, and you say, I am forgiving you. But I don't necessarily believe you need to tell the person you're forgiving them. I think forgiveness needs to be about you releasing yourself and healing yourself.
That's so true. I mean, there's a philosopher that I used quite a bit in my book, well, mostly him, Jacques Derrida, who says that forgiveness happens the moment a dialogue ensues between one person and another. Even if I'm to say to you, I do not forgive you, the fact that I have opened this dialogue, forgiveness has started because a conversation has started between two people who would otherwise never have spoken to each other. Even if if I keep on reiterating over and over and over again, I'm not going to forgive you, the fact I'm actually speaking to you is breaking down that wall in some way.
Yeah, I think forgiveness is complex. I think because trauma and human beings are complex, right? I think what we don't realize is, when you're living in resentment, and this is what happened with me, it's like I lived my life with a certain shade of glasses. Like, you know, when you're wearing those rose-colored glasses, you see the world in a very different way. And for me, I thought this is how everyone saw the world. I went through life thinking everyone behaves like this, everyone acts like this, everyone is angry, everyone is entitled to be angry. And so I was an awful person to people because I just thought this is how life is, right? And then I forgave and I released and I started healing myself. And it was like taking off these glasses and getting a new prescription, you know, like, because I always had glasses. And I remember I went to the optometrist one time and I thought I was seeing the world perfectly fine until I got the right, you know, lenses. And I was like, oh my goodness, everything is in HD. Is this how everyone sees life, right? And I liken that to the element of forgiveness. Once you release the pain, once you release that burden, you're like, oh my goodness, I didn't even know I was carrying all of this. All of a sudden, I'm so light. All of a sudden, I'm making different decisions. And I think as victims, and I don't like the term victims, which I'll go on into later, but as people who are referred to as victims, there is this enclosure of self. You imprison yourself in this pain, whereas the other person gets to live their life, but you stay in this pain and trauma cycle. And when you forgive, you're really taking back your power. You're saying, I refuse to be controlled by you any longer. And I'm taking back this power because I deserve it. So that's how I view the lens of forgiveness.
There's a great phrase when I hear it. I refuse to let you live rent-free in my head any longer.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
You know, I mean, but at what point, was it at the point where you started to develop the ulcers, and you had developed the ulcers? Was that the turning point for you to say, I've got to change my life? I can't because it was a lot of a burden on from 9 months old up to 16. You must have inadvertently been conscious of everything that was going on, because even if you were told to leave the room, you were conscious you were being told to leave the room for a reason. And hearing your family and your parents' family and friends crying and wailing at what they were seeing in this image had to have had it had a horrific effect on you psychologically that you outwardly mightn't have been showing.
Absolutely.
At the point at which you said, I've got to take my life into control at 16?
Absolutely. So it wasn't at the time I got my diagnosis and I was told I was going to die. It was more, I think it was a couple of weeks later, where I was doing something, I can't tell you what it was, but I remember the thought I had. And the thought was, Eugene de Kock killed your father, and now you're letting him kill you too. And I think that was the thought that really shifted my focus. And I was like, whoa, you know, if I continue to live like this, he's going to kill two people in one family, and the other one he wouldn't even have had to be present for, right? And so in that moment, I was very fortunate that my mother encouraged us to read from a very early age. And so we had tons of books in the house. We had like Mind Power books. We had like The Secret. That's the time it was coming out. We had Chicken Soup. We had all these books. And I remember reading these books and not really being a firm believer in them, but starting to realize how powerful the human psyche and mind could be. And I remember thinking to myself, let me just try. Let me just see what this is about. Let me just see if I start shifting my consciousness around my life, if I can find reasons to stay alive. So it didn't start off as, I'm going to forgive Eugene. It was just, I need to figure out how to live. I need to figure out how to stay alive.
And isn't it, sorry for interrupting you.
No, go on.
You know, you went from wanting to die to wanting to live.
Absolutely. It is. It's the currency of choice. Right? As human beings, we don't understand how valuable whether it's like, you know, it's just painted as choice and you're always going to go the one way, or it's the fact that you actually do have choice in some matters, right? And so once our choice is taken from us, that's really when we value it. That's when we're like, nope, you know, I don't want someone to tell me if I'm going to die. I want to choose if I live or die. You know,
that's true. It's the same with, I liken it with COVID, the situation. Places or that you would never want to go to, or that you mightn't have been to, like church, that people mightn't have been to in years, but now that they're not allowed to go in there, they feel that their power has been taken from them and they're being told you can't go. It's different from deciding and choosing, I'm not going to go to mass, or I'm not going to go to church. But when you're told it by a higher power, a governmental power, you can't go in, that's when you start to say, well, damn you, I will go in. Do you know? And I do want to go in.
That's it. And I think as human beings, right, our age gets older, but our psyche remains the same in many ways. Like even with a child, right? When you tell a child, no, you can't do this, and you don't give them a reason that they can accept, they're like, nope, I want to do it because, you know, why not, you know? And I think as we grow older, we still have that psyche where it's like, no, I don't want to be told I'm going to die. I'm going to figure it out. And also being an athlete and I'm a competitor at heart. And so having that psyche, I was determined to stay alive. And so ironically, it ended up leading me to the journey of forgiveness. But I always say to people, when we look at people like Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela, you know, I'll put myself like Candice, whatever, the big stories of life, I'd say, what people tend to do is there's an idolization. So there's this like, oh my God, this human being is so incredible, so unbelievable. But the problem with idolization is it becomes unattainable. When we put people on a pedestal, we can't attain what they've done, right? Because it's so out of reach. And we believe they're special in some way. Whereas I like to tell people, I am not special. I am just someone who chose a path that was going to be the most beneficial to me. And that's what I did. And I then had to forgive because I got to a place in my life where I thought, I don't need to hold on to this. I don't need to live this way. And so I forgave Eugene by myself. And then all of a sudden, as the universe and the life, I'd say, tends to do to us, it presented me with an opportunity to say, oh, you think you forgave him? Go sit with him and see if you really forgave him. And so that's what ended up happening, where I came home one day And I remember my mom saying, hey, I just got a call from the National Prosecuting Authorities, and they want to know if we'd like to go see Eugene. And I was 23 at the time. I'd never fathomed the reality I'd see this man in real life. I'd never thought of it, engaged with it, anything. And all of a sudden it was there. And I remember just saying yes. I remember the first words that came out of my mouth were yes. And I knew in that moment that regardless of what the outcome of our meeting would be, if I didn't go, I would regret it for the rest of my life. And I'm not someone who lives with regret. I don't, like I never look back and regret. So I was like, I have to do this. And so I said yes. And my mom was like, no, if no one wants to go, then we won't go. But if like one person wants to go, we'll go. And I was like, I'm absolutely going. I don't know if everyone else will go, but I'm absolutely going. And then yes. And then that's what led me to actually sitting down with him and speaking to him.
What was it like when you were faced with Eugene de Kock?
It was, I think for me, I genuinely went into the encounter with no real expectation. I went in and I wanted to just experience the moment for what it was going to be. But I think I'd be lying if I didn't say there were certain unconscious beliefs I thought I'd encounter, right? And so the one thing that already kind of threw me back was I thought I was going to walk into this prison cell, cold, icy, steel. And we walked actually into where the guards have their dinner, and it felt like very different to what you'd expect in that moment. It was very welcoming and warm. It was like visiting a very old relative with antique furniture. And so the room and the setting itself was like, okay, this is very strange. We're having tea, we're having biscuits with a man who's, who killed my father. So that kind of like threw me a little bit. But I think once the meeting itself began, I think there were just a lot of emotions. My family didn't know what happened to my father. My mom had heard on the radio that terrorists were shot in a shootout. So my mother knew that it was reported in that way. And we knew it was like my dad was shot by this man. But we never knew what led to that sequence of events. So when the encounter started, the priest was sitting next to me. I happened to be sitting here, and then Eugene was next to the priest. So from my family members, I was the closest to Eugene. And I remember the first thing that stood out was the priest introduced us individually. So I started with my mom, who was at the furthest end of the table. And he said, that's Sandra Mama, widow of the deceased Clinic Masilo Mama. And Eugene de Kock leaned forward and he said, pleasure to meet you. And he leaned back. And so with each and every one of us, as we were introduced, he'd lean forward and say, pleasure to meet you. Then he'd lean back. And so it was very, like those words aren't the words you expect to hear from, an encounter like this. And then my mom started with the questions, and my mom said, hi, Eugene, I just want to know what happened to my husband. And Eugene really got into it. And we found out in that moment, of course, that he actually had a photographic memory. So he remembered my dad's case. He remembered the details, everything. And so what they had done is Eugene de Kock and his team, because he ran a huge team, decided that they were going to set up an ambush for my father, who had been identified as a troublemaker. My father was 25 at the time, but he was a very skilled driver. He was incredibly skilled driver, and he was very sharp. And so my father was targeted, and basically what happened was they put in a Askari, and Askari, for those people who don't know, is a turncoat, someone working for both sides of the government, into my father's camp. This man won my father's trust, and he just said to my dad, oh, we need to just drive into this Nelspruit, which is like an hour away from where my dad was staying. And my dad thought nothing of it. And the morning came, it was very early morning, and my father drove with 3 other gentlemen into Nelspruit. And as they were nearing this Nelspruit bridge, the Askari said, oh, stop the car, I'm gonna get out here, but you just go ahead and I'll catch up with you guys later. So I'm sure my dad, thinking nothing of it at the time, kept on driving. And as they approached the Nelspruit bridge, Eugene de Kock's team had been set up on both sides, and they started firing at my father's minibus. Eugene, looking from the top, realized the bus wasn't coming to a stop. So he ran down the bridge and he emptied out his magazine cartridge on my father. When the car came to a stop and he still saw signs of life in the car, he doused them all in fuel and he set them alight. So it was like the first time we'd had that level of detail of the last moments of my father's life. And so the dialogue continued. And my mother said, but why my husband? There were so many people against, that were in the resistance. Why him? And I think it was the second time in the whole meeting where I felt like I couldn't actually breathe. And Eugene said, no reason. He said there was no reason my father needed to die that day. And it felt like someone had just kicked me in my stomach. So I just held my breath. And so the conversation continued, and my mother started, and she said, you know, I forgive you, Eugene. My grandfather said it, my brother, my younger brother, and then it got to me. And in the whole meeting, it was the first time I could say anything. And I remember saying, hi, Eugene. And he said, hi. And I said, you know, I want to say I forgive you. But before I do, I want to ask you one question. And he looked at me and he said, anything. What's that? And I said, I want to know, do you forgive yourself? And for the first time in the whole encounter, he seemed uneasy. He seemed a little restless. And he said, every time a family comes here, that's one question I hope they never ask me. Then he looked away and he wiped the side of his eye because a tear had come down. And he looked back at me and he said, when you've done the things I've done, how do you forgive yourself? And Mary, I started to sob. I just started to just cry and cry and cry. And what shocked me in that moment was that I wasn't crying for myself and what I had lost. I was crying for this human being that was sitting in front of me, because I realized that there was nothing I could say and there was nothing he could say to take away one another's pain. And I just remember thinking to myself that, wow, you know, this is just a human being. And so I just continued to cry and I said, I forgive you, Eugene. And so the priest asked if there was anything else, and we said no. And so I was sitting the closest to Eugene. And so I stood up first and I walked around to Eugene and he was sitting. And I said, Eugene, would you mind if I gave you a hug? And he looked at me like confused, questioning. And he got up, and he's a huge man, and he like towered over me. And he held me really tightly and he said, I'm so sorry for what I've done. And your father would have been so proud of the woman you've become. And so I went my separate way. Eugene stayed. And I think then this is where, you know, we got to me speaking to you and me starting to speak about the story. So a couple, like the day, I think the day of, you know, everyone kind of found out. It was all over news outlets and everything. And I was asked to write an open letter by someone who was running one of the big publication newspapers in South Africa. And in that newspaper article, I advocated for Eugene's parole, and I, you know, wrote an article in support of it, which he was no longer allowed to come for. Like the previous year, he was told that he's no longer allowed to apply for parole. And so in this letter, I supported his parole. No,
he was sentenced to 226 years.
212 years, yes.
Two life sentences.
Yes.
And he was paroled in 2012.
14.
And
yes.
2019, he was still, so he's effectively out of prison.
Yes. So so he was actually given parole, I think it was March of 2015. I'd written the letter at the end of 2014. Yeah. And so it was a shock to everyone. I had no idea that he'd end up getting released. People said it was due to the letter. No one can really vouch for if it was or if it wasn't. But I think my story was so in the news, you know, and it was happening so frequently. It just happened to really align with when he was released. So, yeah, I advocated for his parole.
What was the reaction to all of that? What was the reaction? Because there have been mixed reaction, because I know he murdered a lawyer, and his mother refused to forgive him because she felt that he was utterly unremorseful, and that she felt he was unremorseful, and others found that he showed no signs of remorse. What was it, do you think, about you that was able to break through that that barrier that others weren't able to break down? You were able to see the human being behind it, because if you were to listen to his brother describing him, he was everything other than the person that he became. He had problems with his eyesight. He was a quiet person who liked to read and was very kind, according to his brother. And you wonder what circumstances he had failed to try and get into the army on many occasions, into different armies, until he set up his own. But you wonder what is it that turns, if we're to believe his brother, how one person can be you can be seen by one person in one way, and suddenly you can become this monster, and then suddenly meet someone like you. The tears can flow, and you can get a sense that of the humanity behind the monster.
Yeah.
Or the
First,
monster.
okay, so I think when it comes to the victims or people who've suffered, due to him, for me, I think I was very clear from the get-go that this is my personal account, this is my personal experience, and I would never force it upon anyone else. Everyone's journey is different. So this is just my outlook and what I choose to do. So I have respect and complete, and utter regard for all the families that have been affected by him. And so coming back to Eugene in and of himself, I think what people fail to acknowledge sometimes, especially within the context of South Africa, is we tend to forget that we were living in a war. It may not have been referred to as a war, but it was. It was a huge, scarring time for a lot of people in this country. And it's easy when you take it out of context to look at Eugene in isolation and see him as this monster. In isolation, you're like, okay, this is a human being who completely went rogue and he just lost his mind. But the truth is, when we look in the context of war and we look at soldiers, right, it just depends on which side of the war field you're on, whether you're going to be celebrated as a hero or as a villain. And I genuinely believe that if history was to recollect things fairly, I do not believe Eugene is a martyr of any kind. I do not believe he's a victim of any kind. I do believe, though, that it is only but fair to look at the system he was serving under, the system that rewarded his behavior, the system that decorated him. This man was not a rogue agent. He was incredibly intelligent. He was working with presidents, and he was recognized by these presidents as being someone who was worth merit. And when the tide turned, which it was always going to turn, some of these presidents went on to receive Nobel Peace Prizes, and he ended up in prison. And so to me, it's just the irony of the times. It's the irony of the situation and the circumstances. I think it's also important to note that within the TRC, many people were given amnesty for their confessions. And so many people went free that would not have gone free, who had committed acts that liken his and worse, and some not, whatever. But I think then it becomes a sliding scale of what we consider atrocity to be, right? If you compare it. So for me, it's very important to not look at Eugene in isolation as this villain that just went rogue in a country that was peaceful and kind. But he was someone who was serving, and he was someone who was devoted to a system that unfortunately just could not stand. And so for me as an individual, and I will emphasize as an individual, so I do not expect anyone else to adopt this thinking, it is just, if we look at the context of the crimes, if we look at the context of the situation that happened, it does not eradicate what he did. It does not make it okay. But I think it is important to note. I think it is something that is important to keep in one's psyche when we discuss this man, and I think the country I come from is a beautiful one, but it's a deeply complicated one. And so Eugene is just a part of a very complex system, I believe, and of other complex people who are still living amongst us today in our societies, that have been ingrained in society now. And I think it was just a terrible time for our country.
It's interesting that when he was testifying and all the way through his prison, he told about so many people being involved in knowing and giving the orders. F.W. de Klerk, the president at the time, was just as involved, if not more involved, than Eugene de Kock. How did it feel to know that all of that your dad's death and other people's deaths were all governmental sanctioned, they weren't rogue people that actually came in and decided they didn't like your father or had a problem with your father, or that your father had some argument or whatever, and it led to his death. This was sanctioned and glorified, if you like, in much the same, I suppose, as Nazism was glorified by the Nazi government. You were doing the right thing for God and for country and for your own people. And you are quite right that one person's monster is another person's hero. Depending on when you're in a war zone and you're fighting for, and that you have to recognize that the people that actually did these horrible things thought that they, in some way, thought that they were on the right side of history.
Absolutely. I think, you know, I think there is so much complexity in human history, right? There's been suffering in every country around the world. There's been some sort of act that has allowed us all to question humanity at our core as to why we allow these acts to continue to occur. I think for me, it's the idea and identity of my father's death is, in understanding it in its entirety, for me, gives it meaning, right? It allows me to look at it and say, my dad fought so that I wouldn't have to. My dad died so that I wouldn't have to. And so it really did put things into perspective for me. And I think it allowed me to delve deeper into my country's history in a way that a lot of people don't have the opportunity to do. I needed to do it in order for my own psyche to wrap my mind around how someone could be killed so brutally. And I think it's also very important I don't see my father as a victim. I see my father as, these were two people with very strong ideologies. And if my father had caught Eugene on a bad day, it might be a different story that we're narrating right now. My father was not someone who was just like meandering on the road, right? Or like just an innocent bystander. He was someone who was very active in changing.
Part of the ANC in the sense that he didn't agree with equal sharing of government or equality of government. Your dad believed in the country returning to the people that originally lived on that in that country. And how would he feel now seeing South Africa, if you like, democracy, and having won, if you like, having beaten the system? How would you think that your father would feel? Would he be pleased with the way it is now?
Yeah, you know, I think it's very important. I think it is, you know, like when you dive into South African history and you see the complexity of it, I think my father, I don't believe, I mean, from the recollections and what I have of him, I think he was someone who, yes, he was a part of the Pan-African Congress and they did have a different ideology to the ANC. But I think it's important to note both parties needed one another. The one could not exist without the other. Without the PAC's aggression, the ANC could have never had the intellect, right? So my father was a part of the group that really did fight back, literally fight. And I'm not saying the ANC didn't. The ANC fought back too, but they were much more from an intellectual standpoint as well. So they brought the intellect with
diplomacy and dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it's
here in Ireland, understand all of that. You know, you have to have the freedom fighters and the people trying to broker the democratic piece, and the people who gave their lives. We've had it for centuries. We have very similar struggles for democracy and repression of colonialism, and that's why. At that time, we had Dunn's workers here in Ireland who actually came out and strike to fight for against apartheid. They refused to sell African goods or South African goods in the stores, and it became huge here in Ireland. And that's how I suppose we have that allegiance towards the South African people in a sense, because we both fought against discrimination and to get our country back.
Absolutely. And I think so, you know, with understanding of the complexities of history, I think my father today, I think, would look at this and, you know, be proud to a large degree. Obviously, every country's got its issues. I think it's very important, though, that when we reflect on history, we have to take the whole context. We can't take things in isolation, because once you take things in isolation, it mars the whole story, right? And so, yes, even though my father was a part of the Pan-African Congress, I believe that today what I am living, what I get to experience, would be something he would be proud of, you know. And I believe that it is just very important that just as we move forward, that yes, you know, there's a lot of issues that South Africa has, but I always think it's important to look in perspective that we are a very young democracy. We're incredibly young. I mean, especially as opposed to the rest of the world. And so it's important to realize we are still going through growing pains, right? We're only like 28 years, I believe, into democracy now. And any 28-year-old left to run a country does not know what it's doing. So it's just like about looking at it in its entirety and being like, do I believe my dad would be proud of what the country is right now? I think to a massive degree, yes. I think there are its issues. I think it's got situations at hand. But like I'm saying, I think he was always going to be the person who laid down his life for injustice, right? Like he was never going to be the guy who just sat in the periphery and let life happen. And I know this to be true of his character. And I also know it to be true because it's very much who I am in many ways. I'm very conviction driven. And I refuse for wrongdoing to go on if I'm around to fix it. So yeah, at least I'd like to think he'd be happy.
You see yourself as political or social conscious? Are you socially conscious or are you politically motivated? Do you see yourself ever going down the political route? I'm sure it's been suggested to you, but being a political person is being a completely different animal altogether. There's no room for emotion. There's no room. I don't think there's very little room for humanity. Humanity is kind of left at the door when you become a politician the part, because especially if you're part of a party, you have to follow the party line, and it's almost like doing something that you don't want to do. And I don't see you as that type of person. I see you as a free spirit who follows their own inner belief.
Absolutely.
Values.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. I first want to preface this by saying I've got massive respect for politics. I think the governing of a country, any institution, I think is so critical and so crucial. Politicians in and of themselves, I know there's a lot that goes on around that world that I myself cannot engage with, but I've got massive respect for people who go in with intention. And yes, I see how that world can get marred, but I don't want to paint all politicians with the same brush and say, oh, politics is not for me, I'm above it, you know, because I don't believe I am. I think all of us as human beings are flawed. But I think for me as an individual, even though the conversation usually does come up because I am very outspoken, people will be like, run for president, you know, and I'm like, I'm very flattered by it. But as you said, I'm driven by social awareness, I'm driven by social cause, and I'm driven by seeing real change mobilize. And Mary, I don't know if you're seeing this, but for me, my perception is people during this COVID time, I don't know if it's been the past 2 or 3 years, but there has been a buildup of, it's the common man that's really going to start changing the world. Yeah. I think what we're starting to realize is we've been living in a system where we've been living in a hierarchy, right? Where it's like, okay, I'm going to complain to the politician will change policy.
Giving too much power.
Exactly.
We've dictated our autonomy. Absolutely. And the very things that your father fought for, the very things that the ANC and your father and people like him fought for is being abdicated again to another power. The African government in your case, and in our case, the Irish government. When are we going to take control of our own lives and say no, you know, and have autonomy over our lives?
Oh yeah, I think it's one of those things where, at least for me, it makes me excited that I think celebrity is changing. I genuinely see a future whereby we're not looking at celebrities like, oh, you've got this flashy car, you this or that. It's more going to be like how I perceive it, at least, or at least I can envision it, is the kind of celebrities humans are going to start expecting are the kind of people who are fighting for a cause, the kind of people who are putting their actions, their money, their talent in the absolutely.
You should be celebrating people doing, and you were celebrated by the African nation and by the United Nations as one of the 20 greatest people fighting for peace in Africa, in South Africa. How did that feel?
It's
when you look in the mirror, do you say, I'm one of the 20 people in Africa fighting?
Mary, it's very interesting for me. I think although I do believe that, there is a groundswell of recognizing people who are doing the work and in the communities. I've always believed that it's important to use whatever platform you have for the spreading of good and for the spreading of change. I think there's so much change required. For me, it does. I appreciate it so much. I appreciate being recognized. I appreciate the accolades, and I appreciate all of it. But to be dead honest, it doesn't. It's not something I consider, if I'm being honest. It's not something I lead with. I'm not like, ooh, I don't wake up like, oh, I am. A part of me wishes I did.
You were described as well as a catalyst for change. You are, but your story became the basis for a documentary entitled, a very important documentary entitled It's a Pleasure to Meet You. And it just goes back to de Kock's phrase. I just find, when you said that to me, it's a pleasure to meet you, and he leaning forward in the seat, it just seemed to me so matter of fact, and so I don't know, there's a certain sort of distance, that a chasm that you can't exactly explain. Like, how could somebody that did such things just lean forward and say matter of factly, it's a pleasure to meet you? It seems almost like Silence of the Lambs. that when
oh my,
that's what, like,
I'm
thinking when see de Kock, the image of him leaning forward, it's a pleasure to meet you. It's like Anthony Hopkins just about to pounce, but that documentary.
Yes, so I mean, those words do elicit a reaction, especially when you put it into the context in which, they were said. And I think, so Sue Williamson is the artist who created that documentary, and I absolutely adore her. She's actually the reason I was recognized by Vogue Paris as well. So Sue and I have worked we've walked a really long path together. And she had actually attended a talk I'd done. It was a very intimate, very small talk. And her and I kept in touch, and then we ended up doing this documentary. And I think for me, the reason I continue to spread this message, the reason I continue to do the work I do, firstly, my career before all of this was always going to be in humanitarianism and in entertainment. So I've always had those two parts of myself, and ironically, they just merged into one thing. But it was always about helping people, see themselves. I think that's my mission on earth. It's not, let's stop glorifying people out there. And that's why I think for me, accolades are very interesting. I appreciate them and I love them. And obviously, we all do things and we want to be recognized for what we do. But I think people are so good at looking at others and what others are capable of, and not looking at what they themselves are capable of. And so that's my life mission. And so it's a pleasure to meet you. It's myself and Sia who come into a space, and Sue did it brilliantly because she told both of us we had a story that shared a common person, which was Eugene. So we knew this about each other, but both of us, he assumed I was angry. I assumed he had forgiven. And so the beauty of watching this documentary unfold is watching how both of us react to the other story. And so especially Sia's reaction to me, when I'm like, and I forgave, and Sia's like, ooh, there's a very palpable feeling he had. And I remember obviously being in the room and engaging with him. But I think it's so beautiful to see in the documentary, because I think what the documentary is showing is two people experience the same thing. They can have a dialogue in a healthy and respectful way without seeing the same situation in the same way.
It has to be said, Seal, the singer, I don't know his story, but without knowing his story, he strikes me as an absolutely, utterly fascinating man. Do you know? I mean, it must have been. Were you at all in awe when you met him first? You know, you talk about this kind of people putting people on pedestals, and we tend to do it with celebrities. And rightly so. The celebrities that we should be admiring are the ones like yourself who are doing something to break the cycle of hatred, and not singers. But Seal is somebody who has gone through his own struggles with apartheid, and he has created a life for himself, and he hasn't become a victim of his background in the same way as you haven't become a victim. You have, in many respects, it has taken a complete circle, because your dad fought for democracy and fought hard and gave his life for democracy, and now you're giving your life for bringing about peace. The country that your dad loved.
That's beautiful. Thank you. That's a really beautiful analogy.
It is. I mean, your dad has gone halfway around. If you look on it, I suppose, like a clock, your dad has done halfway around to try and bring about democracy, and you've continued the rest of the way. Now we have democracy. Let's have peace.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for saying that. I think it's just a really beautiful way to look at it. I don't believe I've necessarily looked at it that way. I do feel a lot of obligation, I believe, to my father. I think every time I think of the fact that I'm now 29, my dad passed away when he was 25, and I keep outliving him, right? Like, so I'm now getting to 30. He never got to see 30. So every year I get to live, I feel very, I feel as though I owe him. I owe him a life of being happy. I owe him a life of being authentic. I owe him a life of standing up for myself. I owe him a life of standing up for others. So whenever, like, people ask me, do you feel like your dad is a guardian angel? I say, I think of him more as a compass. Anytime I want to feel sorry for myself, I'm like, oh, am I doing anything right? I think, you know what, you get to be alive right now. Like, there's nothing more than that, right? You get to live. And you get to live a beautiful life, and you get to do things that your father could have never dreamt of. And so I do feel that place in the world where I feel like, for me, I mean, and this is not everyone's goal, and nor should it be, but for me, I have a mission in the world, not to just preach, because I feel like this tends to be that sometimes, but to show. I want people to see that, no, I'm not just speaking about forgiveness. What I'm really speaking about is you owning your life, you owning your place in the world. And I try and do that by showing of myself. Like, I do silly dance videos on Instagram, and I post things. And, I want people to see that I am living a full life.
Coffee with Candice.
Yes. I speak to other people. Exactly. I speak to other people. And my life is not that of just being serious. I think I want to show people that you are a full human being. You should love a spectrum. Don't box yourself in. Be you. The world needs you, right? They're not replicas of other people.
How does your mother feel about all of this? Because has your mother managed to find a similar space to have forgiven Eugene de Kock, and to have grown, and to have put away the book? That's a constant reminder of your dad's death and the horrors. Has she managed to live her life free of the horror, if you like? Has she grown in any way from since?
Yes. Absolutely. I think my mom is incredibly strong and incredibly resilient. I mean, she was 24. She was 24 when my dad passed away, and she had a baby who was 9 months and a 4-year-old boy, right? And so she had these 2 children, and she figured it out, And in many ways, if it wasn't for my mom's constant push through and her constant need. Like, you know, I think all of us can look at our parents and look at everything they did wrong. But I look at myself and I look at the life I get to live and the kind of ambitions I get to have and the kind of life and stages I get to speak to people like you, right? It's like all because she taught me that was like, that there was a bigger life out there, that I didn't have to be confined by my situation, circumstance, and life. And so in many ways, you know, whether it's the way I dress, my fashion sense, my aspirations, the life I love, it's all because my mother allowed me to see that I was able of attaining that. And it's because of her life and the way she was living.
And in a sense, when you look back at your diagnosis, in a sense actually helped you to live rather than killing you.
Oh, yes.
Had it not been for that doctor noticing how bad your ulcers were, and had your ulcers not been that bad, perhaps you mightn't have, your path mightn't have taken the direction it did. Things happen for a reason.
That's it. That's it. And I think for me, Mary, what I'm trying to help people do is, human beings, we change the most under pressure. We change the most in pain, right? And I'm trying to show people that you don't need to go through this massive pain to take back your life. You don't need to get yourself to a place where you're so depressed, so miserable before you change, that you can change where you are. You can take ownership of your life where you are, because I'm yet to meet a single human being walking the planet that does not have some sort of pain that, you know, they live with. And so I just hope that my life in some way will become a catalyst for people to think about themselves differently, and in some ways just heal themselves so that they can be the best version of themselves, and then the world will be better for it, I believe.
Well, I don't think there's a better conclusion to this interview than that, Candice. It's been an absolute, I mean it, it's been an inspiration listening to you. I find it hard to believe that you're still only 29. You're an old soul. And it's been a privilege. It's been an absolute privilege. And your book, Forgiveness Redefined, is on sale on Amazon.com.
It is. Mary, thank you. Yes, thank you so much. It's been such an honor, and thank you so much for having me on your platform. I've loved speaking to you.
It's been an absolute, look, sometimes when you meet people, you feel inadequate. And this was a moment for me of total inadequacy.
Oh, no.
Just thank you for making me feel so inadequate.
Oh, no.
You know, I mean, you just go through life and you think, you know, you have problems, and you wallow in self-pity at times, and then you meet people like you, and you're just jolted out of your seat and reminded that you know, life is for living.
Oh, I appreciate that, Mary. I think that's how I want to leave you feeling, that life is worth living, not so much inadequate.
Life is worth living. Cinderella leis an clár, that's the end of the show for today. Until the next time, Lacuna Day, Bawalum Tugaler Chiacana, Sonus August Bra. I wish you peace, happiness, and love. August Gade Shifslon. Bye bye. Thank you, Candice.
Thank you, Mary. Bye bye.